Morning, class. How are y'all doing? We've got a question on the board here. A warm-up question, and it is referring to different types of trade barriers that we talked about yesterday. And so, who might like to read this? Jayla, please.
In 1987, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution that prohibited countries from buying oil from South Africa in an effort to persuade the nation to end the racist policies of apartheid. This is an example of an A, blockade, B, embargo, C, quota, or D, tariff.
And the answer is B is correct. It is an embargo. Remember, embargo is the most severe type of trade barrier that can be passed or established. It is a total ban on certain products from a particular country. And again, remember that it's often motivated by political, ideological, sometimes economic issues. We've talked about the embargo that the OPEC nations, members, put against the United States because of our support for Israel back in the 70s, and we talked about the U.S.'s current embargo with Cuba, right? We don't import Cuban cigars like we used to. Actually, we export a lot to Cuba, but we just don't import. That may be changing as that relationship forms up. This example up here is a real-world example. UN passed this resolution back in '87 because of South Africans' racist policies of apartheid. And they were very effective. They changed that government. That was part of the reason that things changed in South Africa. And you saw the emergence of Nelson Mandela, and he gained the Nobel Peace Prize. And he was the first president of sort of the new South African nation. So this is sort of a real world example, and these are the different types of trade barriers that we can study. So let's take a look at these. I'm not quite sure how far we got through with the slides yesterday, but we'll visit those once again, and then I've got a couple little clips I want to show you, debating about the pros and cons. Remember, all these trade barriers, they have good things associated with them, and then they also have certain costs associated with them, right? So you could have retaliation. You know, you may protect some industries, but you're going to hurt other people. Things might be more expensive, right? If imports have to start paying tariffs, and there's quotas. There's not so many, so supply is less, price goes up. So pluses and minuses, we want to look at those. The effects of these trade barriers on different sectors and people in the economy. And then we'll look at different trading blocks. We call them free trade agreements. You know, the big argument is free trade or protectionism, right? All these things have to do with protecting U.S. industries, raising revenues, sort of strengthening the U.S. economy, but they have certain ramifications, retaliation, negative and positive. So free trade versus protectionism. And all things like NAFTA and the EU, these are all forms of free trade associations, agreements, treaties. So we'll look at the benefits and the costs involved in those. Okay, so let me pull up these slides, and we'll take a walk through here. I kind of forget how far we got with these, but I think we were talking about, obviously talking, let me cue this up to full screen. Did we do all this? Let's just, we talked about these three, and we talked about this fourth one here, right? Embargoes. Then we looked at the different pluses and minuses associated with that. Fewer choices, higher prices, a hard time for workers in other industries, especially the import-export industries, and then the retaliation from other countries. So these are sort of the backlash to trade barriers in the United States. Of course, they do certain positive things too that we highlighted before. So you've got these two schools of thought: protectionism and free traders. Protectionists and free traders. If you're a protectionist, you favor trade barriers. And you argue that these trade barriers protect national security. Like, we don't want to be totally dependent on Middle Eastern oil. If there's some crisis in the Middle East, that we might be out of oil. So we want to develop our own domestic industries, and we want to trade with more friendly partners, maybe like Canada. So one of the reasons that we do have trade barriers is to protect national security. Often that's in the area of food, oil and gas, sometimes some manufacturing jobs that are essential to national security. Protects infant industries in a nation, new emerging companies and industries that can't really quite yet compete in the global market. So it may have some, maybe some subsidies to them, maybe some tax breaks, maybe some other restrictions on their competitors to sort of protect these infant emerging industries. And then obviously the big thing is it protects domestic jobs, because with free trade often jobs seek out the cheapest place to manufacture those jobs. In terms of NAFTA, it's obviously a lot of jobs ended up going to Mexico. Free trade improves efficiency. Free trade makes companies compete on a global market, right? So they have to be more efficient. Offers us a wider variety of goods and at cheaper prices, right? So there's certain good things associated with free trade, certain drawbacks also. So free trade is sort of encouraged by these trading association, trading blocks, if you will, groups of nations that work together through these agreements. The most famous one that we're associated with is the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. There was a lot of debate about NAFTA in the Trump-Clinton campaign. Bernie Sanders weighed in on NAFTA.
What was their opinions?
Hillary was for it because her husband had and she was part of that administration who started it and agreed to it initially. Trump and Bernie Sanders were both against it. They thought the effects of NAFTA outweighed the benefits.
What's your opinion on it?
The big problem with it is that a lot of jobs ended up going to Mexico. The U.S. Manufacturer jobs went elsewhere. They probably would have gone elsewhere anyway. They could have gone to Southeast Asia. They could have gone to other countries. They went to Mexico. It's been very difficult for the Mexican farmers, who can't really compete with all these cheap, subsidized, big farm products from the United States. You know, you can blame NAFTA, but do these things happen even without this reduction of tariffs and things like that through NAFTA? Overall, I guess I'm not that for it as much, but EU is one of these trading blocks, and Associated Southeast Asian Nations is also one. So in Europe, you have this. In Southeast Asia, you have this other one. So different types, but they're all sort of these free trade agreements. Let's look at NAFTA to start with. It was, as we said, established by the Clinton administration, went in effect in '94, and originally we had about 15% trade tariffs for imports and exports between U.S. and Canada and U.S. and Mexico. So it was they're paying 15% to import or export to the United States, and those were all gradually reduced by NAFTA. So things could go across the border without very many restrictions. NAFTA also lowered some environmental restrictions. We'll hear a little bit more about that too. World Bank, who has lots of economists and looks at these things in terms of economic impact, says that NAFTA had a small positive effect on the economic growth and productivity in both U.S. and Mexico. You know, other institutions said it had a large impact, a very big impact. Trade between these three countries increased fourfold, but was that because of NAFTA? Was that because of the economy was getting better? You know, so it's hard to just single out what was the effect of NAFTA because so many things are
Is
impacted.
Canada being as like severely affected by NAFTA as the U.S. and Mexico? Or is it just like?
Yes, because Canada, it's helped them in a lot of ways. They've been able to export very cheaper to the United States. A lot of their natural resources like lumber and oil and gas things. So that's opened up a better market for them. They hadn't had to pay these tariffs. They've done away with sort of quotas and all certain things like that. So it's been good for them. I mean, I'm sure they import a lot of things from the United States and Mexico too. So it's helped them in a lot of ways. I think United States is the one that's feeling the pinch the most because of this loss of jobs. Hard to compete with some of that. EU was formed in '93. It's 28 nations now. They share the currency of the euro. Some of them have their own currency. We know England is still on the pound, and a couple other countries have not adopted the euro, but most of them do. It's great. In Europe, you can ride a train from Germany to France to Spain to Italy. It's like going from Georgia to South Carolina. There's really no barriers like that, and it really creates a real this idea of a trading bloc, a real sort of unifying kind of impact. EU is the largest free trade association of nations in the world today. Lastly, we'll take a look at this Association of Southeast Asian Nations. It began in '92 in the same way. 10 nations of Southeast Asia. They promote economic growth and stability and by promoting free trade between those 10 countries. So very successful. But I'm sure they have some of the same issues that we're experiencing with NAFTA. EU has had some issues about immigrant workers going from country to country, and so all of these have some issues with them. We're going to look at some pluses and minuses of each of those. So we got a couple questions to finish this unit up. Who'd like to do the first one for us here? Victor, can you read this?
A person who favors a protectionist trade policy would most likely
You can kind of read through those. And what do you call for an end of quotas? Would they support a reduction in tariffs? Call for supporting national security and American jobs? Claim that trade restrictions result in fewer choices and higher prices? Or a protectionist, right? A protectionist is not going to call for the end of quotas. A protectionist is not going to support reduction in tariffs, but they are definitely going to call for supporting national security. Remember, some of these things, these trade barriers were because to support national security and support American jobs. Bertha, could you do the second one, please?
What is the most important purpose of NAFTA? A, to increase trade barriers between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. B, to reduce trade barriers between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. C, to help the Mexican economy with American and Canadian subsidies. D, to compete with the nations of the European Union.
And the answer is?
B.
Exactly. C and B, to reduce trade barriers between U.S., Canada, and Mexico. This is a free trade agreement, so they're trying to reduce those trade barriers. Okay. Thank you, Cody. That was great.